How's it going, folks? We'll just wait a moment here or two and get started in about a minute. Yep, for those just joining us, we'll start at 12:01. So just a few seconds from now. Okay, thanks everybody for joining us on our webinar series for the Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics here at The Ohio State University. We're pleased to have Dr. Brian Rowe with us today. Before I introduce Dr. Rowe, however, I did want to just finishing up poking into the chat some information on our next webinar, and it will be by Dr. Amy Ando, the chair of our department. And the title of that is going to be, let me just hit the send on this, and you'll have the title and a link in the chat, which you can see. So it's on December 11th, also at 12 o'clock. The title is Urban Willingness to Pay to Protect Nearby Farmland, Nature, and Local Food. So just a sort of plug for our future webinars. Appreciate your attendance today. And certainly, if you would like to attend that one, go ahead to the link in the chat and go ahead and register for that one. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Dr. Brian Rowe, who is the Van Buren Professor in the Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics at Ohio State University. He's been here since 1998. It's great to have him here. He's one of the folks you can always rely on to have an interesting topic. This one especially interesting to give a webinar on, and we're really happy that he's here with us today. Brian, I'll let you go ahead and do any additional intros you want to do. But one final thing is, folks, if you do have questions for Dr. Rowe, you're all muted. Feel free to use the chat feature, which I'll enable, or the Q&A feature. Uh, if you'd like to send in a question, we'll sort of hold those until the end, and then I'll ask them to Brian at the end of the webinar. Okay, Brian, over to you. Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Brent. And thanks for those of you joining online today. Appreciate your interest in the topic and looking forward to any questions you might have. Again, feel free to drop those into the Q&A or the chat functionality, and we'll get to those as the presentation goes on. But I'm very interested in sharing with you today some initial research I've been undertaking with internal funding here from the Van Buren Fund here in the Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics. And it has to do with changes that I see forthcoming in the demand for food. And all this is being triggered by a new set of novel medications that are coming onto the marketplace. And we'll talk about those today. So overview for today is to first put food demand and the environmental impacts that go along with food demand into context with the role of obesity and overweight, key trends here in the United States. I'll then jump in and do some background on this new class of anti-obesity medications that are transforming this space. And then I'll share some results from an initial study of how anti-obesity medications are affecting people's food expenditures, the types of food that they demand, even their waste of food. And then we'll look at some conclusions and think about some of the future research agenda that we need to address this topic. So the big context here, if we think about health and food trends in the United States over the past decades, here we've got a couple of figures tracing out over the 60s up through 2010 changes in a couple of key things. Obesity, the rate of obesity in the gray, and those who, which is defined as a body mass index of 30 or more. And in the green line there on the left, you see the typical caloric intake as tracked from the 1970s through 2010. And the upward trends are quite obvious. And we're seeing, for example, in terms of caloric intake, an increase of 400 to 500 calories per person occurring, whereas in terms of prevalence of obesity, we see that number having gone from below 20% all the way up through the 1980s, up into this is about the low 30%, but we now know that in 2024, we're looking at about a 40% obesity rate in the United States, as well as an additional 30% qualifying as overweight, that BMI between 25 and 30. On the right, you see some trends in macronutrient intake, and you do see some changes, discrete changes around the year 2000 when high protein, low carbohydrate diets became more of the fad around the turn of the millennium. And you do see a downtick in that blue line of carbs and steady uptick in protein as part of the macronutrient intake of US citizens since 1970. This is important. That increased weight is important because it has to do with the level of calories that people are taking in and hence the amount of food that they're demanding. For example, here is a standard relationship that most nutritionists would be able to cite for you. But what you see here is the relationship between, for example, here it's a 30-year-old male with 75 kilos of lean body mass. As the percent of weight increases that is attributable to fat, we see that the resting need for calories increases at kind of a sharp pace. For example, someone who has got a very lean mass, say down in the single digits, might only require around 1900 calories for their kind of base metabolic rate of calorie burn. As that fraction goes up into the 20s and 30s, we see a pretty significant increase in the calories needed just, again, to maintain basic bodily function. And this is known as the Mueller equation from nutrition. What that does is it increases as we increase the amount of body fat on our weights, on our body fat on our bodies, the amount of calories that we need to burn on a regular basis. And a couple of Italian scholars, Serafini and Todi, back in 2016, deemed this metabolic food waste. And they classified it as the annual mass of food consumed by someone who's overweight or obese beyond that consumed if they were at a normal weight range, which, again, crudely is defined as BMI of 25 or less. So in their sample of Italians that they looked at in 2016 study, that equated to about 127 kilos per person per year. For someone who is obese, they would consume that much additional food than someone of normal weight. And in that overweight range, that was about 63 kilos of food per year, increasing the demand for food because of this kind of bodily composition issue. And on the right here, you can see where among their sample from this particular study, the different types of foods that they would draw on for those additional pounds of food intake each year, with a lot coming out of animal products and cereals and starchy items as well. Now, these also then translate, as any food production does, into impacts on the environment. An interesting study by an author by the name of Tom back in 2016 and some of their colleagues shows how changes in kind of the intake of food can really affect some of those indicators of environmental impacts. So, for example, they did this thought experiment, which they then simulated out, where they took the current US diet at the time, and then they did a couple of things. They did a situation where they would simulate out what would happen if people kept their same portfolio of foods that they were buying, but just reduced the calories to the amount that was equivalent to being of normal weight. That's the blue dots here. And then others where they would correct the food mix to follow the USDA recommendations, and one where they would do both reduce calories as well as get the mix of foods that met nutritional requirements. Here you see that simply reducing calories had a pretty substantial impact on those key environmental indicators, with the amount of energy being used declining by roughly 10%, the amount of blue water being dedicated to food consumption going down by almost 10%. And again, overall greenhouse gas creation going down by, looks like 9 to 10% as well. And so these additional calories really do have interesting impacts in terms of the environment as well. And so this turns to the classic issue of how do we deal with obesity in the United States? And one key issue is to think about how do we break that down? Well, we can break it down by thinking about the different motivations or styles of reasons that people might be obese. And there's been work on this in the nutrition community as well. Cifuentes and others list out what's become known as the obesity phenotype classification here. And it typically breaks down into 4 key phenotypes, that is behavioral reasons here. And they go by names such as hungry brain, where people need a higher number of calories at each meal to reach fullness, hungry gut, where the gut seems to be emptying out faster than intended or for would be in a normal situation, slow burn, where people just have a very low energy metabolism, and then emotional hunger, where people are eating in excess due to negative mood and reward-seeking behavior. And as they look across the population in the US, they see an array of different fractions of people falling into either these categories individually or into some of these overlapping categories. And you can see a large number of these, almost 2/3, have some implication with this hungry brain and hungry gut phenotypes here, where there are definitely issues that need to be addressed in that sphere in order to be able to effectively address the excess pounds being carried by these individuals. So with greater information, then we can think about how this might actually be treated. And we can look at the various types of treatment approaches that are available right now and perhaps in the near future. So this is a graph coming out of a group led by Albo and their colleagues. And we can see moving from left to right kind of what we might expect in that solid blue line, a typical weight gain that might occur for individuals due to just the natural cycle of a lot of Americans, kind of a slow uptick at about 2 pounds of gain per year. And then it works through the various other interventions that can address obesity. As we move down, the first approach would be standard behavioral treatments, where you might change exercise and diet and attentiveness to food intake. And these sadly have largely been minimally effective. Typically, you can get a decrease of perhaps 3 to 5% body weight. That's typically considered a very strong intervention to have that type. But typically after the initiation of that, oftentimes people asymptotically move back to pre levels of weight. There's then standard pharma approaches where you might get Fentop and other well-known medications that come from development back in the 60s and 70s. Those can have moderate effectiveness and can typically get you to that kind of 5 to 10% reduction in body weight, with, again, kind of mixed figures for longer-term efficacy. Some of the meal replacement coupled with behavioral modification can then get you to that next layer, maybe in the low teens or mid 10% range of efficacy. The drugs that we'll be looking at more carefully here, known as GLP-1 receptor agonists, will then get you to that next layer, typically in that 15 to 20% range. There are new drugs in development as we speak, with the very first ones out that then get you beyond that 20% level of body weight reduction from their use. And then finally, we've got an oldie but a goodie, bariatric surgery and other surgical approaches, which have a long history of being able to, particularly for those who might be body mass index of 40 or greater, achieve up to 30% body weight reduction and have a good track record of being able to maintain this over the decades. But the interesting mover on this are these second to bottom two ones, the GLP-1 RAs and these new combination therapies that are coming onto the marketplace. So the full name here is glucagon-like peptide 1 receptor agonists, quite a mouthful, but some of the names you're probably much more familiar with. They go under the names of semaglutide, which is your Ozempic, Wegovy, tirzepatide, which comes as Zepbound or Mounjaro, liraglutide, Saxenda, and dulaglutide, Trulicity. So what are these and what do they do? Well, GLP-1 is a hormone generated in the small intestine, and it really shapes human food demand by several methods. It lowers blood sugar levels, and hence its connection and longer-term implications treating type 2 diabetes. It also slows the emptying of the stomach, which then gets to that one type of obesity phenotype that we looked at earlier. It also signals fullness or satiety to the brain, which again then attacks this other type of obesity phenotype. And there are many other actions that this drug takes as well that are being uncovered through randomized clinical trials. This drug has quite a history. There were, as much as a century ago, there were some ideas of how some of these elements might be working together. But then in the 80s, there was some isolation of the GLP-1 hormone. And then in the 90s, there were some ideas inspired by one scientist's interaction with saliva taken from a Gila monster about how this might be created and then used as a pharmacological agent. And through development into the 90s, that led to the first injectable and licensed medication in the early 2000s. And so these drugs have been in use for more than 19 years at this point, although their use for obesity is much more novel, with the first one being approved for use specifically for obesity in 2014. And these drugs do have a really kind of eye-opening effect on people's body weight. Here we've got some randomized controlled trial in clinics where people here in this case are using semaglutide, which again is the Ozempic and Wegovy types of things. 20 weeks groups are let in, and that gets them down their body weight's reduction by about 10%. Then they randomly assign people to a placebo or to continue on this. And in this trial, the typical participant dropped 18% of their body weight over the course of a little over a year, whereas those on placebo kind of slowly moved their way back towards their original weights, though never quite got there after even an additional 48 weeks off of the medication. So there is some lasting reduction, though the trend is obviously back towards initial. These combination therapies, of which tirzepatide is one, this is a Lilly product created here, are even stronger in terms of some of their effects. The tirzepatide does this GLP synthesis, as well as another known as a GIP synthesis as well. And here, after 88 weeks, these numbers are coming down more to the 25% range, which is again kind of crowding in on the efficacy of bariatric surgery. So highly efficacious in terms of some of their impacts on people's loss of body weight. And indeed, head to head, these newer type 2, newer drugs are showing themselves to be even more efficacious than the earlier drugs like the Ozempics and the Wegovys. Now, these also have impacts beyond just obesity and diabetes. There's indications that it might reduce alcohol cravings, might reduce fat buildup in the liver, might work to limit kidney disease, deal with inflammation more generally, and therefore is implicated in reducing cardiovascular issues and even in the lungs. And some of the results here are kind of eye-opening. When they looked at a 500,000 people's records and compared those who were on one of these GLP medications against those who weren't. For example, opioid overdoses here are seen as being much lower in the blue than those who are not on that medication. On the bottom panel, again, over 500,000 people being tracked. Those with alcohol intoxication at a follow-up visit was much lower if they were on a GLP-1 than if they were not. And a typical question here is, what about the long-term implications of this? Are there kind of side effects that might not being appreciated here that were going to expose themselves? And while there hasn't been like a 30-year study, we are getting studies out to the 4 to 7 year range. So for example, this one by Linkoff and others in the New England Journal of Medicine looked at over 17,000 individuals, looking at those who were assigned a semaglutide versus a placebo, and found that the reduction in cause of death from any cause of death was about 19% lower after 4 years for those on semaglutide versus those on placebo. So again, not super long term, but we're getting out to 4 years. And probably the longest study is that of about a 7-year clinical trial where they're finding that those on one of these GLP-1 agonists were demonstrating continuous reductions in some of their metrics with no unexpected adverse events for that group there. So some pretty interesting and compelling results there. This, of course, has really attracted interest from drug makers, with forecasts coming out of the economists and some of their sources that by the early 2030s, this could be over $150 billion global market for these goods, with a lot of this demand coming from the United States in equal proportions to treat diabetes and obesity, but then with another large chunk coming from demand from global sources. And in fact, this has had a tremendous effect, for example, on Novo Nordisk, the creator of Wegovy and Ozempic. Even though these two numbers don't really shouldn't be put side by side, it is still quite compelling that the market value of Novo Nordisk has now exceeded the annual GDP of Denmark, its home country. So again, very different numbers. One's a flow and one's a stock, but it still kind of speaks to the power that these medications have had in terms of their interest in the financial sector. In the United States, we have an interesting level of uptake of this medication already. Kaiser Family Foundation and Montero polled people from April of this year, published in May, and they found that 1 in 8 adults report ever having taken this a GLP-1 drug, with about a 60-40 split, diabetes versus weight loss as the motivation. Now, 54% said it was difficult to afford the cost, even those who were insured, with about 6% currently reporting use as of spring of 24. About a third had heard a lot about these drugs. Medicare is currently prohibited from covering this as a straight up weight loss drug. It can kind of move them into the side if it's treating something specifically like diabetes or trying to prevent cardiovascular disease, but it's not allowed to just straight up write a prescription for this and have it covered. Although 6 in 10 surveyed thought that Medicare should cover them. And this was, regardless of political affiliation, people were pretty evenly split on thinking that this should be covered. So there is some interest in this being covered by public insurance programs. These drugs are not cheap by any means in terms of their market prices. So if we look at some of the prices for these, we've got, for example, these monthly prices or prices for a 30-day transacting in the market range from anywhere from $600 a month up to $1,400 a month, again, in US uninsured prices. Globally, these are much lower. reflecting perhaps closer to their cost of production. And in fact, the estimated cost of production for a few of these is not incredibly high. For example, even though semaglutide, your Ozempics and Wegovy's of the world are being priced out at about $800 a month, the estimated production cost for those is about $40 a month. These are manufactured using recombinant DNA techniques, and of course, there's right now shortages in the market as the popularity of these drugs are taking off, and there are some supply chain issues. But we would expect prices to decline over time with increased competition, and eventually there may be coming off of patent as well. So there may be, again, might be decades off, but low-cost generics might be available. And indeed, there are lots of competition ramping up in this space. This busy presentation basically shows the anti-obesity medication pipeline. Over here to the right, you can see projections for what's going to come into the marketplace in 25 and 26 and 27. All told, this is about 18 different formulations from 9 different major pharmaceutical companies across the globe. So right now, the market is largely held by Novo Nordisk and by Lilly, but we see any number of other folks coming into the marketplace here over the next few years. So given all this, given the interest in this, how does this affect people's demand for food? Returning to our theme of food expenditures. Last April, I reached out to over 500 consumers in the US from a trusted research site known as Prolific, and found about 500 folks who self-identified as a current user of one of these medications. And some of the early work of this has been published in an article in the journal Nutrients with a student, Jamil Mansouri, and myself. And there's also another version of this talking more about the food savings. It's under review as we speak. Again, this was all internally funded from OSU. The folks come from a wide range of ages, household incomes, and educational levels. Also, a mix of racial self-identification. That's quite similar to US. Most of the folks had insurance in this sample, and about a 45-55 split male-female. In terms of their experience with the medication, we see a broad array of folks. We had almost 30% who are new to the medication within 90 days of that, and then over a quarter that had been on the medication for over a year. Most folks were on semaglutide, your Ozempic or your Wegovy, and that's the green of the pie chart here on the right, with nearly a quarter on tirzepatide, the Zepbounds of the world. When people are asked about what they were paying for these drugs, a fair number of these had some type of insurance coverage. The average out-of-pocket cost on a monthly basis was about $175, the median at $60. When we asked them to think and reflect upon how much they spent before they went on the medication on different types of food, and then how much they spent currently, we find that the median person in the sample reported a $35 reduction in terms of the dollars spent per week on dining out, about $750 less for the median person. Again, that's the person 50% spent more, 50% spent less than this. For groceries and food at home, about $1 a week less on alcohol, and kind of all summed up. A slightly different sample gave responses to all those categories, so we have a slightly different median for that. But we're seeing non-trivial reductions in the mean and the median level of food expenditures on a weekly basis. Now, we didn't ask about other expenditures in detail, but we did ask them whether or not they would agree with the following phrase: I spend more money at the pharmacy to help me treat the side effects of this medication. This medication is known to create side effects such as nausea, constipation, vomiting, other things like that. And about 30% agreed that they were probably paying more on kind of at the pharmacy because of the medication use. when we look at the performance in this group compared to some of those earlier studies, for those who began the medication when they had a BMI greater than 25 or were overweight or obese, we are seeing a very similar type of response as we did in some of those RCTs, where we see the weight loss, the percent reduction in body weight, increase over time. So that those who have been on it for more than a year, we're reporting a median weight loss of around 17% and a mean weight loss of about 20% of their initial body weight. In terms of their calorie reduction, we also see some pretty interesting results here. Those who were in that overweight range, 25 to 30 BMI, reported, again, a median reduction in calories of around 25% and a mean of around 15%. Those who had BMIs greater than 30, and so we're kind of classifying here as obese, that moves up to kind of the mid to the upper 20s in terms of the mean and the median reduction in terms of the fraction of calories that they're taking in currently as opposed to their pre-medication days. We then kind of asked them to reflect on some of these statements and say whether they would agree with them or not. And you can see to the right the amount of agreement with this. And so we definitely are seeing that 46% believe that they are spending less on food after being on the medication than before. Interestingly, 61% say they're buying less food. So that leaves us kind of this 15% gap where our hypothesis is that this might be that folks are spending the same amount on food. They might be buying less in quantity, but perhaps they're quality upgrading and buying perhaps more expensive food. And so they might not be spending less on food, even though they're buying less food. And indeed, you do see that 35% agree that they are buying more expensive foods in general. Importantly, at the bottom, almost 80% say that the types of food that they're eating have changed. And again, this can have very interesting knock-on effects for food demand and distribution of kind of food across the food system. We also prompted them to see if they're actually wasting less food or wasting more food due to the diet. And so we asked them if they would agree that since starting the medication, that they're wasting more food. And we see that about a quarter on average said that they're wasting more food since beginning the medication, with the rest either not agreeing or disagreeing with that statement. And here we can see that typically it's a bit transitory. We've got on the right here 2 clusters, those who were reporting no nausea, and on the right, those who were reporting some nausea. But for both cases, typically, and again, the height here is the percent that agree that they're wasting more food, that they are less likely to agree that they're wasting more food as they've been more accustomed to the medication, been on that medication longer. Although if they have nausea, there tends to be more agreement that they're wasting food. But we also found that if they've increased their vegetable consumption, they tend to be less likely to agree that they're wasting more food. Also some kind of education level effects. What about that change in food types that they're interested in? There's been a little bit of research on this in the extant literature. Number of studies have kind of focused on individuals who have been in RCTs or other studies, and note that there is a decrease in preference for starchy foods. Dairy comes out of a couple of studies. Kind of sweets also have been implicated by several studies as being less preferred. Savory foods and high-fat foods have also been implicated. When we turn to this particular study, we see that indeed, in terms of the macronutrients or kind of large categories of food, those in the red here saying that they said that they're eating less of this food after they have started the medication is highest for alcohol, with 65% agreeing that they are consuming less alcohol after starting the medication, and 54% saying that for carbs. Only a small portion say that they're eating fewer proteins. When we drill down another layer into other food categories, we can see that those where people are reporting less food intake after medication, fried foods, sweets, pasta, and dairy are among those categories that are most likely to suffer reductions in demand from those on this medication. On the far right, though, we're seeing demand for vegetables, fruit, healthy fats, and to some extent fish increasing since starting the medication. With the interesting one right in the middle, there's basically an equal number of people saying that they're eating more meat and eating less meat, and then a fair number of people saying that they haven't really changed since starting the medication. So meat seems to be kind of a neutral in terms of eating more or less after starting this. And when you drill down even a layer further, you can see some patterns in terms of some of the things that are driving this change. For example, for alcohol and fried foods, those who are saying that they're going to eat less of this are typically those individuals who are suffering side effects. Whereas some of the other categories are driven by demographics. So for dairy, those in the older age categories are more likely to cut dairy. Though those with higher out-of-pocket medical costs and kind of been on the medication maybe 180 days to a year are more likely to actually add dairy. So there's a little bit of give and take there as well. So as we kind of reflect on this information and the study here, I think it's clear that novel anti-obesity medications, they're going to have this chance to really impact global health. Weight loss and obesity have been implicated as a very high cost malady for American and global populations to have. Lots of studies have documented the comorbidities and the costs of leading a lifestyle that has obesity as part of it. These medications are showing efficacious efficacy in being able to address some of these issues, and then even having spillover effects to other drugs. Long-term 10-year plus types of studies, even though the drugs have been in the marketplace for almost 20 years now, there's not a lot of high quality decadal types of studies out there. So there's still more information to be had out there in terms of understanding the 10-year plus types of implications of these medications. But the 4 to 7 year types of studies have initial indications of moderate to mild concerns rather than any larger concerns. And also that the amounts and types of reduction in food intake are also going to be in play here with those who are on these medications. We're reducing per person food demand for those who are on these medications, altering the mix of food demand, and also a possibility of reducing food waste among those on these medications as well. But there's still a lot of questions. For example, how will medication diffusion affect global resource demand, right? How will this work its way through the different levels and mixes of foods to affect demands on land use, water use, energy use? How will it affect the environmental impacts with those production in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, any type of implications for water quality? And then how will that impact market prices for food, and then commodities, and then eventually all those inputs like land that go to produce these items? To understand that, though, we're going to need to understand what drives patient uptake of the medication, what drives adherence to the medication, why might people discontinue, might they come back on and kind of restart the medication in the long term? What does that ebb and flow look like? And how does insurance play into that? And then you got some other kind of compelling questions. So will reduced demand among those who are on this medication, maybe that would pull food prices down and then spur even more consumption among those consumers who don't have access to the drug. So maybe that would increase weight for some and decrease weight for others. A compelling possibility, but something that would have to be explored. Also, a compelling possibility is what happens when one person in a multi-person household goes on this medication. one can imagine spillovers and multiple effects, right? One person's eating less, and so that means more food left over for everybody else. So maybe others are eating more and gaining weight, or maybe this one person changes their style, they're eating less, and maybe that then spills over, and those habits also spill over to others in the household who are not medicated. There might be a positive spillover. Some compelling things to think about. Other questions, will the presence of these medications alter the types of research and development being pursued by food manufacturers? Here in this visual here, you see a hint of this already. Nestle has created a line of food to appeal to people on these drugs called Vital Pursuit, where they think they've got formulations of foods that will be attractive to individuals on these medications. Be very curious to see how this might percolate through the broader food R&D landscape. Other questions, how do the increased profits from pharmaceutical companies, are those greater than, similar to, or smaller than any decreased profits that might occur along the food supply chain? And what might the scope of those decreased profits be? Or might people be able to reformulate their way out of this and have kind of no impact on profits in the food sector? Other questions around whether widespread coverage of these medications by public and private insurers, will they pay for themselves over time through reduced expenditures on healthcare? And or will people live longer and therefore demand more food because they're living longer, and kind of offset some of the intensive margin gains, intensive margin reductions of food demand that we might be seeing in the short run? So lots of compelling questions here as we think about the implications of these medications for kind of the short, medium, and long run of the food system, and the sustainability and resilience of the food system and American healthcare in general. All right, I'll pause there and see what questions there might be.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Brian. Outstanding presentation. Super interesting. Got a lot of questions. I'm just going to sort of scroll through them here and ask them to you. And you can also feel free to look into the Q&A feature as well. Although there's one question from Debbie in the chat that we'll get to second. So the first question was from Jenny LaRue, and it's an interesting question about the local insurance in their county. And I think you sort of mentioned that Medicare or Medicaid is not currently allowing people to cover this as just a weight loss medication, which sounds consistent. So probably private insurance companies have done the same thing, I guess, have followed Medicaid. I mean, from your study or other studies you've seen, are people paying for this on their own? Is that a thing out there, or are they somehow getting it covered by having other diagnoses that would be allow them to get it covered? I mean, do you have any information on that? I think that's kind of the question there.
Yeah, the Montero study, Kaiser Family Foundation, found that those people on this were about 60-40 using it for diabetes treatments. And so I would assume a large proportion of those are being covered to some extent by insurance. Medicare Part D will then cover it if it's being prescribed for someone who's obese that also has like accelerated or elevated levels of cardiovascular risk. And so there's some of these side doors that are slowly opening through some of the insurance programs. And again, like Jenny was suggesting, probably a lot of private insurers might be mirroring this or going through their own calculus as well to decide if and when they might want to open up these potential floodgate for these medications.
But I mean, the numbers you showed as well, I mean, it's not insubstantial, these costs. If you're going to pay for this on your own, I mean, that's 15, up to 15, was it up to $800 a month? I thought was basically what I saw.
Yeah, but what we're also showing is that in this sample, I think we had about 60% of the people who were saving as much on food as they were spending for their meds. So on net, just the simple food med trade-off was breaking even or making them money basically on that. So if you're paying purely out of pocket with no couching there, there's a chance that you could come close to at least offsetting some of that with reductions in food spending, particularly if you were a high food spender before, but you're probably not going to get all the way there. But the big thing this research does is it kind of opens up that conversation that, oh yeah, when people go on these medications, they will be spending less in all likelihood on food, and that's a source for paying for some of these medications, kind of like I call it the pharma eating big foods lunch, basically.
Yeah, so that's super interesting. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So, but that also you're not accounting for, which presumably some future studies will show, the long-term health benefits potentially, right? That the gain in or reduction in long-term health impacts, I guess you'd expect those to eventually emerge, right?
Yeah, and there's a nice study by Allison Sexton Ward and her colleagues at USC's Schaefer Institute. And they've done some simulation work trying to see what would happen if kind of Medicaid or Medicare opened up and covered some of these drugs. What would be the impact on long-term costs to the healthcare system? And those initial results are pretty positive in the long term, right? Because again, this is it. You get the upfront costs immediately for the drug, weights come down, and then some of the comorbidities, which will show up in 2, 5, 10 years from individuals, then start to take dollars off the books of these same insurers. And so it's a much more of a long-term play, as well as there being short-term supply chain issues. Even if they open this up, the amount of medication being created right now is probably not enough to meet demands if they were really to open up the faucets for coverage of this.
So, well, okay, so I'm going to get to Debbie's question next here in a second. This is just so super interesting. So, but by my calculations and looking at what you showed, if I understood correctly, it's almost 1 out of 8 people are on these medications now in the US, right? And there is somewhere between a 15 and 20% reduction in calorie consumption for those 1 out of 8 people. Is that about correct?
So right now it's about 6%, 12%, 1 out of 8 have tried it, have been on it at some point.
Okay.
Half of
Not
that
on a
amount was reported being on it in, I think it was April of 24. That's probably crept up half a percentage point or more since April, just because I think some of the supply chain issues have been dealt with now and some insurance coverage has expanded.
but that would be a direct kind of relationship, calorie reduction to weight loss reduction, right? So if they're expecting to get a 15 to 20% loss in weight, about that much, assuming no change in exercise and whatnot, right?
In fact, there's been some quotes from Walmart. They've done research across stores, and they do find a reduction in food sales in stores that have high levels of sales of the GLP-1 medications in the same store. And so
Wow.
they've been seeing this correlation at the store level
Wow.
within their own kind of supply chains.
Yeah. Super interesting. Debbie Roush asked in the chat about the long-term effects here. So are people, so it does seem to, the that one slide you had did seem to indicate that when people are off the medication, they start to revert, right? And you showed that with the sort of paired RCT, right? So that's the thing, right? If you're not, I mean, I'm assuming you can't be on this forever. I don't know, maybe you can, but if you go off it, you do run the real risk that you lose some of the gains that you either had as an individual, and society would kind of lose those gains as well on the demand side, right?
Correct. So at this point, you see reversion to pre-medication weight once you come off of this. It does take some time. So in that one slide I showed, it was a year later after being off the medication, they were still, 5 to 10% below their initial weight. But give them another year, they're going to be back to that initial weight. Now they are working on particular formulations. I've seen one where a single dose has lasting power for 4 to 6 months. And so one would imagine that the pricing and kind of cost efficacy of those types of formulations would be out there. The other thing that hasn't really been pressed right now in the development is looking for pulse strategies where people might be on it for several months and then off it and then back on it. If there are any implications of kind of cycling and what that might do to long-term issues, if that would be positive, negative, or neutral. So that's
So,
probably
yeah.
where a lot of this research will head in the near future, I would guess.
Okay. Well, I mean, that seems like something that we'd want to get more answers on. I mean, obviously not you necessarily, but at least, society to understand the demand effect, but also to understand the health effects. And I'm sure many people are asking that, can I stay on this long term? Because, we all know how complicated it is to sort of keep the weight off, right, on our own. So Brian or Robin Ralston asked an interesting question here related to the study that you did, and it's more specific about the study and how you did that study, and whether you were able to measure what people ate via food frequency questionnaires or diet records. I wonder if you could answer that one real quick.
Yeah, we didn't use any of the typical validated measures of food type here. That's part of the current research agenda, is to do that. This was basically a pilot study to start looking at implications. We've got some requests in for funding to be able to do exactly that. And also then to look at kind of grocery store receipts in a much more granular level to see how this is actually converting to not only changes in food intake, but then kind of food purchasing habits at the whole household level. And so that's next on the agenda. This was just to get in the ballpark of understanding broad categories of food, which ones might be more or less preferred after starting medication. So yeah, didn't quite get to the high quality validated instruments here, Robin.
It, and Kathy Sponheim with this other question, you might have to help me out on this. I'm not so familiar with this term food as medicine and food as RX or food RX and how those might come into play. Are you familiar with those terminologies? I don't mean to put you on the spot on that one, but
Yeah, generally speaking, they may have a more specific term, but yeah, so with many of this group of consumers under doctor care for nutrition, how do you anticipate food as medicine and food RX to come into play as a recommended from their doctor? Um, yeah, so yeah, I guess I don't quite know how to answer that question here. The meds change food preference, so it would appear. And it seems to change them in a preference of what is also supportive of improved nutrition, right? They're moving off of kind of the calorically dense items, fried foods, sweets. They're moving towards more volumetric types of foods, fruit and vegetables that are more caloric, more nutritionally dense and less calorically dense. And so it almost seems like a complement to any food as RX approach. When you go back to those obesity phenotypes for people with the hungry gut phenotype, the food as RX approach is oftentimes the emphasis. My understanding, at least talking to folks in this space, they'll then prescribe diets that are much more, volume, the food has a lot of volume in terms of per caloric, per calorie. And that goes to, fruits and vegetables that have a lot of fiber in it. And so I think it actually works as a complement here because people naturally seem to gravitate to those types of foods after they go on the medication. So Kathy, hope that gives you perspective that's helpful there. I'm not sure if I danced around your question or not.
well, I thought that slide was, I mean, for me, that one and one of the earlier ones showing what happens when people go off the different go on the different medications, and then sort of over time what happens. Those two were super interesting. And so the one that showed the increases sort of on the right, which were the fruits and vegetables and things like that, and then had the meat in the middle, which is about a wash, right? And then the fried foods, I guess the more dense foods on the left. That was, I mean, so the suggestion there is that um, the semaglutide or whatever the medication is actually doing that. Is that the medication doing that, you think, or is that like are there also complementary dietary recommendations from doctors, et cetera, that come along with the medications that might be prompting people in that direction? What's your thought on that? Is that just a function of the medication itself, getting people to kind of be more healthy in a sense, right?
Yeah, so here we just ask, we didn't ask for what type of dietary guidance they were receiving since they went on the medication. I'm sure that many of them were receiving dietary advice as well, though some of the studies from the previous literature were just asking about cravings and kind of straight up food preference questions. And they came to this very similar types of responses. People were not preferring, fried foods, sweets, keeping away from starches, and were then increasing kind of a preference for fruits and vegetables. And so I think there is at least some preference element here, but it would take a better study than what I have on the books right here to be able to disentangle how much of that preference shift is due to medical advice versus inherent stimulus of the medicine itself. So yeah, excellent question. And I think we don't know that for certain.
Yeah, on the demand side, though, it does sort of bring up the question of whether or not, how extensive the environmental impacts might actually be, right? So if there's little impact on meat, which is the sort of most environmentally demanding of the foods, and the other foods on the right hand side, they're fruits, vegetables, things like that. Those are water intensive. Also take about the same amount of nitrogen and things like that. So they're pretty input intensive, but fewer hectares, right? Fewer acres sort of engaged in those than the typical crops that would be producing the stuff on the left hand side. So it's interesting. Wow, there's a lot to do down the road, sort of thinking about how that would play out on the landscape, right? Because that would be a really complicated question to answer.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's a lot to do. And that's, again, part of this emerging research agenda here is to really push that through to understand the broader implications.
Yeah. Yeah, one other question from Jenny LaRue, basically on really the sort of timing of this. And I think you answered it, but I'm not 100% clear. Is it required that you go off these drugs after a certain amount of time, or is it just something recommended? I mean, how does that work? Like if you wanted to stay on them forever, could you? If you got the doctor to say yes, or is it really after 8 months you got to be done?
Yeah, this is all up in the air because this is pretty new territory. For diabetes, I believe this is a lifetime drug. So if you've got diabetes, this is your treatment for diabetes, right? So I think this, so since we're in the very early stages of prescribing this for weight loss, um, and all the studies are showing that once you go off it, you're moving back to the middle. The big gap now is trying to understand what can you do for maintenance long term that reduces the cost, reduces dependency on medication. One could imagine over time, there might, again, we've talked about these before, different means of cycling on and off the medication, if that seems to be efficacious. Again, that's purely conjecture on my part. There's no studies of this or even recommendations of this, but one can imagine there'll be research in this space to understand what does a maintenance regime look like that is kind of financially sustainable in the long term. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, yeah, since you pointed out with diabetes that, you could potentially be on this forever. I guess I was thinking with Jenny's question, is it something like an antibiotic here that you kind of have to go off it after a while,
Yeah.
but not
Yeah,
okay.
I think people are seeing this more like statins, right? Something you just go on and you're on them.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a good question in the chat about the long-term effects, and that's a good sort of, consequence down the road. It's like if you're extending lifespan, right? If people are living longer, there is over the long run potentially an offsetting effect on the food demand side. Although obviously older people tend to eat less than younger people, but still, that could happen down the road. It's something we don't know about, right? And we can't really measure yet, I guess, right?
Yeah, I mean that 4-year study of 19% reduction in all causes of death is pretty eye-opening.
Right.
Again, it's not a decadal study, so there's still a possibility that, at 15 years, some weird toxicity creeps up that's happening here, or there's a major change. Those are all still potentially in the works. To my understanding, I haven't seen any studies that extend over 10 years, people that have been on the medication for more than 10 years. So that's still, in play. We don't know what those effects are. But at least in that medium term, it looks like it's supportive in multiple fronts of lots of desirable biological outcomes.
Great. So I guess one last question. I'm just going to remind everybody here before we do jump off that I'm putting in the chat the web link for the next webinar by Dr. Ando, or Urban Willingness to Pay to Protect Nearby Farmland, Nature, and Local Food. So please join us for that if you'd like. So the last question, Jenny again asked it, and I think it is a burning question. Are there any sort of unintended bad consequences that have been observed out there? Any people
Yeah,
sort of in trouble?
there's definitely a group of adverse affected individuals, right? That just doesn't work for them. Those GI things blow up and become, really nasty, right? So, um, and so there's going to be a fraction of folks who have very negative responses to the medication. And so at this point, it seems small, but we'll see as again, we get out to larger and larger populations if that gains in terms of the fraction of people that are affected that way. But at this point, it seems um, not dissimilar to most drugs. Yeah.
Great. Great. Well, Brian, we can't thank you enough for joining us today. Super interesting talk. Spurred a lot of great questions, interesting dialogue, really interesting area for research. Thanks for sharing it with us today. Folks, if you have any questions of Brian, I'm sure he's happy to take them by email. It's row.1, I assume, right?
30.
Oh, you were number 30. Okay. row.30@osu.edu. Feel free to email Brian and he'll be able to answer your questions. So thanks a lot, Brian.
Thank you. All right. Good day, folks.
Yep. Take care.